Okay, so, crabs, Journal 19. Remember what I said about omens? Well, sometimes omens are cold and hard and easy to figure. I had spent quite a few days moping around, feeling depressed and sorry for myself, not doing much of anything, when I woke one morning to find 4 inches of snow had fallen during the night. It was still coming down in fat, wet flakes, undisturbed by wind. My firewood and equipment had disappeared under soft mounds of snow, and the landscape looked suddenly and completely whitewashed. So I had a decision to make. Very soon I'd be trapped for the winter. My exit required open water and portages that had no more than a foot or so of snow. I couldn't imagine plowing through any more than that with a canoe on my shoulders. Our little bay had a skin of ice on it every morning. It was a matter of leaving now, before a real cold snap froze up the waterways completely, or staying all winter. An easy decision, but it took that snowfall to yank me out of the fog of depression I was in. I spent the morning getting fed, checking what equipment I had, and carefully studying the map. Again, I had 2 choices: go back the way I came, or try to work out a better route. One that was either easier or quicker. I was going to try another route. The time I spent coming down the river before I fell over the falls would be doubled or quadrupled going the other way. That current had been pretty strong, and there was still the other narrow creek after the first lake, the one I tried to learn to steer on. All that upriver travel and many portages made me shudder. So I studied the map for a long time. I could find Ithaca Camp easily enough, and there were a few possible routes, but I had to try and figure out by the contours whether I would have to travel up or down a particular river, to keep my eye open for rapids and falls, to estimate the length of my portages. The length changes with the seasons, and so does the depth of the rapids. All that took some thought, but I put together a route that was a bit longer than my original, and I hoped a lot easier. It was late afternoon by then, and the snow had stopped. A breeze began to bend the smoke from the fire. That would mean the storm clouds might move off during the night. I searched out another of Mary's caches and lugged it back to the fire. It was then I realized that the deep snow was going to be a problem. My legs were damp from the snow melting on my pants, and I knew now that in winter dampness or wetness was my greatest enemy. It's impossible to keep warm if you are wet. If you stay dry and stay on the move, it can get super cold and you'll still be safe, up to a point of course. Your body heat will keep you warm. So what I needed was leggings. Since I planned to carry only one pack, I took another and cut it up, and in the fading light I made a crude pair of leggings that tied on just above my knee. Then, since I was such a wonderful tailor, I took another pack, cut 3 holes in it, and had a coat that would come in handy if I ran into cold wind or more snow. It was just coming up on light when I got up. The snow looked light gray, the line of the trees almost black. I was kind of looking forward to the trip after doing nothing for so long. I tried not to look too far forward, though, to my coming back to the city. I decided to take one day at a time. I didn't bother with a fire. All the equipment was packed up. Just drank some water. I kept a bottle in my sleeping bag each night so it wouldn't freeze, and munched a mouthful of the awful but nourishing stuff Mary kept in the caches: jerky, fat, and berries, all pounded together into chewy bars. After last-minute inventory, waterproofed my sleeping bags, tent, and fly, extra clothes, food, map, and compass, matches, waterproof this time, I was standing on the shore, ready to go. After the canoe was loaded up, I turned and tried to work up a goodbye to what had been my home for 5 months or more. But it looked so different, snow-covered and empty. From where I stood, you could hardly even tell anyone had been there. It looked like just another clearing, cold and desperate. So I turned, shook the snow off my boots, and pushed out onto the lake. There's a strange beauty to the bush in winter. It was still overcast that morning, and the landscape was a blend of black, white, and shades of gray. The lake was the color of shale and smooth. With its brightness muted without the sun, the snow was a softened white stretching away from the water. There were patches of birch along the shore. The black blotches on the white bark and the dark, smaller branches brought them out of the background in sharp relief. The gray hardwoods stood naked and cold. In the distance, the hills showed a faint touch of reddish-brown. The only color in the scene came from the stands of vivid green spruce and cedars that crowded together in the low places. I won't record all the details of the trip. The weather held pretty well. That is to say, it was cold, but not cold enough to lock up all the lakes. The shorelines were all fringed with ice, though. I got some light snow, some sun, a good mixture, and I made pretty good time all in all. For one thing, I had only one pack to carry. That meant one trip on the portage because I could take both pack and canoe at one time. For another, I was in good shape, strong, and able to work all day. By the morning of the fourth day, I was ready for the last leg. I had to do a portage of around 8 miles, and it ended up on the shore of the Lake Ithaca camp was on. My plan was to spend the night where the portage began and devote the next day to the crossing. The map showed the terrain to be rolling hills, challenging, but nothing terrible. I got up at dawn as usual and hung the sleeping bags while I prepared a big breakfast with lots of strong tea and more food than usual. The bags have to be hung so as to dry out the moisture that gathers in them during the night from your body heat and breathing. If you don't do that, the bag will be cold the next night and never really warm up. The wind should have been a warning, but I was anxious to attack that portage. As I cooked and ate breakfast, the wind was picking up speed quickly and turning colder. You should always pay attention to the wind if you live outdoors. Sailors know that. So did I. But as I said, my mind was on other things. I had no idea I was about to walk into the teeth of the worst and earliest blizzard for years and almost kill myself in the process. I was at a water level in hilly country. There's no real horizon in country like that, and the wind is cut down and deflected by the hills. Anyway, off I went, trudging through the snow in my classy leggings. I was following what was probably a fisherman's portage in summer, so aside from the difficulties of walking uphill in the snow, the going was pretty reasonable. Another thing I didn't notice early enough, though, was body temperature. Normally, a while after I started working, I'd be shedding some clothing so as not to get damp with sweat. But today I had no desire to remove anything. As a matter of fact, when I topped a hill later in the morning and put down the canoe and packed to rest, I felt colder and dug out my bag coat to give me some protection against the rising wind. It was bitter cold by now. My breath clouds were snatched away each time I exhaled. Around the edges of my toque and on my sideburns, the water vapor from my breath had frozen to form a rim of ice. I looked up at the top branches of the hardwoods to see them waving frantically. Lots of wind up there, I thought. There was no sign in the darkening sky, a sky of deep gray with a tinge of purple in the northwest. When the snow arrived, tiny flakes whipping frantically around, I knew I was in for something. The problem was, I figured I must be halfway to the lake. It would be crazy to turn back, so I shouldered my burdens and marched on, weaving downhill through the trees, trying not to slide. It wasn't long after that I was wearing every piece of clothing I owned. I had one pair of wool socks stuffed down my neck to make a scarf, and another on my hands. The snow was thick now and even in the little valleys between the hills. It was swirling and driving, piling up quickly on the ground and packing into the creases in my clothing. I must have looked like a ghost. I wore the compass on a thong around my neck and consulted it frequently because I couldn't see very far. I was glad my head was under the canoe, protected from the angry wind. Soon fear began to hammer away at me, strengthening with every gust of the icy wind. I felt that I had to keep moving so I wouldn't freeze. I knew I was still on course, but even when I reached the lake, what then? Try to cross it in a blinding blizzard? I was between two high hills now, in a gully where the wind was a bit less violent. I decided to rest. Flipping the canoe off my shoulders, I dropped the pack and sat down on it. No longer protected by the hull of the boat, my face and hands soon felt the sting of the wind, and I feared that frostbite was on the way. I looked around. Over on my right, about 10 yards along the gully, was a huge deadfall. A thick maple had fallen from the steep bank, its roots ripped from the shallow soil, and had come to rest on a giant granite boulder. Between the boulder and the roots was a sort of cave. When I saw that, I made a quick and, as it turned out, wise decision. Animals hold up in storms, I thought. So do people if they have any sense. I lugged all my truck over to the spot. Using my paddle, I scooped most of the snow out of the cave. There wasn't much because the big root network, clogged with dirt, took the force of the wind. I left enough snow to make a floor by packing it down. Then I dragged the canoe to the windward side and propped it between rock and tree. I pulled the tent out of the pack and, using the nearly horizontal tree trunk as a ridgepole, fashioned a roof by tying the lines to the bottom gunwale of the canoe on one side and weighing down the other side with rocks. I packed snow around the little house, banking it with the paddle so that no wind could enter from the ground level. I checked the thing over very carefully, walking around it a couple times. Then I entered on the leeward side, dragging the pack in after me. The only problem now was that the snow floor would be cold. I took off my canvas pack coat, folded one of the sleeping bags, and stuffed it inside, making a thick pillow. I sat down on it and leaned against the tree roots, grateful for the chance to rest. The tiny cave soon warmed up. I could still hear the wind howling and wailing now, which meant that the storm was getting even worse. The nylon roof of my cubbyhole rustled and snapped, reminding me that it would need support against the weight of the snow. Quickly scooting outside, I felt my way along the maple trunk, punished by the wind and blinded by the snow. I got my paddle and snapped off a few branches from the tree trunk. Back inside, I wedged the 3 branches between the boulder and the ground. On the canoe side, I used the paddle as a rafter. Things looked pretty secure now. I was dry, warm, and safe. Naturally, I immediately thought of food and was soon gnawing away on jerky. Water was a bit of a problem. I ate snow very slowly so as not to cool myself down too much. Once my thirst was gone, the warmth and rest made me drowsy. I soon dropped off. I dozed on and off all night, coming fully awake after daylight had arrived. Of course, the only way I knew it was daylight was to lift a corner of the nylon and push a lot of the snow into the side. The wind was still about its work, but seemed less severe. There was one hell of a lot of snow out there, too. The cave felt strange, sort of oppressive, and until I pulled the nylon aside a bit, I found it hard to get my breath. That could only mean that my cave had been sealed off by the drifting snow, and I had been rebreathing the air inside. I didn't want to leave the flap open. Icy air quickly sneaked in, bringing gusts of fine powdered snow with it, so I snapped off a twig from the maple and carefully punched a half-dozen holes through my roof in places where the nylon didn't quite meet the rock. I sat back against the roots. Hang on a second. A bit of light came in, enough to let me grope around and find some food. I filled a cup with snow, as to experiment, to see if the cave's heat was enough to melt it. Nope. Although it was pretty warm inside, enough so the nylon roof, which sagged between my makeshift rafters with the weight of the snow, was coated with a film of ice. I sat back against the roots and munched some food. I started to think about what I would do when I got back. Don't think I missed my parents, or anybody else, for that matter, because I didn't. But I really had no plan, or many choices. Or did I? Maybe I had more choices than I thought. One thing I was sure about, I would decide. I'd had it with living my life the way other people wanted, Mary told me. Waiting around for somebody else to fix your life is a fool's game. Well, I was ready to take the responsibility. No more complaints about how hard done by I was. Hell, if I could make it out of this storm, I could handle the rest of it. And that may not sound like much, but it was a start, and it gave me a good feeling. In the bush, if you don't take responsibility for yourself, you just don't last. You go home hating the place, or you don't make it back at all. Sure, it's good if you have somebody like Mary to help you and get you ready, but when it comes right down to it, you're on your own. That was the difference between her and my parents and the other adults I've known. Mary would teach me anything. Cooking over a fire, where to find dry wood in a rainstorm, how not to get lost. But somehow she always made it clear that the reason she taught me was so I wouldn't need her around all the time. My parents were the opposite, always trying to make me dependent so they could control me. They picked my school, my career, even tried to choose my friends, then wondered why I never had any. Mary had said to me, "The greatest compliment you can give a teacher, Crabbe, is to say, 'I don't need you anymore.'" Well, I figured I was ready to begin to live my life. I was healthy, strong, reasonably smart, and young. The fact that I didn't have a clue what I'd do with my life didn't bother me at all. One step at a time. Having thought that, I fell asleep again.